Well, now let me turn to the lecture. Chris Pissarides really doesn't need much introduction. He's just one of the finest and most insightful economists in the profession today. It's incredible to have such a great economist living and working in England, in London. He's, of course, Nobel Prize winner. His work has studied unemployment dynamics and the labour market more generally. We're going to see about that. It's very topical. He's one of the top academics in economics, but he also knows how to communicate. He has a great interest in policy. In fact, he's even spent time on the Monetary Policy Committee of his birthplace country, Cyprus, before it joined the Euro. So he's a general economist, striking high as an academic and also in the policy and debate and as a communicator of economics. So it's wonderful that Chris has agreed to give the 2012 public lecture. So I'll hand over to Chris Pissarides.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very generous introduction. Of course, what Richard didn't say is that Callum and his colleagues won the Young Economist Award. I got the Old Economist Award. Still. The topic I've chosen today is unemployment. It's the topic where I've done most of my research, in fact, over the last, I don't know, too many years, 30, 35 years, 40 maybe. And I'm aware, although I cannot see you anymore with all these lights in front of me, I'm aware that the vast majority of you are students, mainly sixth form. So part of the objective, of part of the approach, rather, that I followed in preparing these slides and the talk are addressing the question of how do economists do research. You know, what's the approach that we'll follow to the research, which I thought you might find interesting from the methodological point of view. You know, how do we go about discovering about a problem that sort of bothers us, in my case being unemployment, rather than just talk about policy recommendations of what to do about it to reduce it and all that, although that will come out naturally. So the topics that I'm going to touch upon are five, the ones that you see here. And it's the way that the macroeconomist, which is what I consider myself, you know, someone interested in the performance of the country as a whole, would go about studying the problem. First of all, you need to identify the problem. And that's what I'm going to do in topic number 1. I guess you also need to spell correctly the countries, which, as you can see up there, is not quite done that way, but I hope that's the only aberration. Then, secondly, I'm going to ask, how do economists go about studying the behavior of the market as a whole, and is that a good way is that a good approach to understanding unemployment? Of course, economists we always start from supply and demand analysis, so I'm going to show you why I think supply and demand analysis is not a satisfactory way of going about understanding unemployment. And then I'm going to introduce the approach that I spent most of my career working on, which is called search and matching. Now, when I give public talks outside, especially, people are always very curious, and they ask me, you know, what kind of idea could be a kind of Nobel Prize winning idea? And my answer is that here it is. You know, under topic number 3 is precisely the idea that was cited by the Nobel Committee when 2 American colleagues and myself won it 2 years ago. And as you will see, like most ideas in sciences, I guess, not economics, is very simple. You might think, you know, well, is that it? But as someone, as a scientist whose name I forget once said, the most difficult ideas to formalize in science and research are the ones that you can state most simply. So that's my excuse for the simplicity of what you're going to see. And then I'm going to use that framework, after I explain it to you, the search and matching, to study the unemployment outcomes in some countries, including Britain. And that's what I call under the Beveridge curve. It's the tool that we use within this framework to see what unemployment is in different countries and why. And finally, I'm going to do another application given the age group here, which is youth unemployment. But then I realized on my way here that maybe I haven't been very tactful to finish my talk with unemployment as you're coming out of school. Don't get too depressed. Things are not as bad as they seem. Okay, so let's begin then with topic number 1, unemployment in the OECD and the country differences and the response to the Great Recession. And here what I'm going to do is to show you several graphs and define the problem, as it were. You know, what is it that we want to understand, and move on from there. Now, what you will discover is that there are big differences in unemployment across countries, even in years of normal economic activity. And there are also big differences between young and older workers, and also big differences in the response of unemployment to the recession. These are the three problems, as it were, that I want to understand. Why is it that countries have different unemployment experiences? I'm going to show you what those are. Why is it that young and older workers have different unemployment experiences again? And why is it that when the world, or at least the Western world, was hit by recession in 2008, countries responded differently to that shock, if we can call it that. Now, what you see here is unemployment as is conventionally defined in normal times. The last time that our European economies and general industrial economies were sort of going through normal times, were the 5 years before the crisis. You could say they were in normal times. And you can see that there's a big variation. Like there are some countries that had unemployment below 4%. You know, if we take the Europeans, Norway, Switzerland, Netherlands were around 4%, but then there were other countries that had as much unemployment as 14, 15, even if we exclude Poland and Slovakia, because their economies were not quite mature. You can see, you know, Germany at that time, in normal times, had an unemployment of 10%. And then Spain, Greece, France had very high unemployment rates. Now, the ones in red are always the average for Europe, the average for all the industrial countries, OECD, and then the United Kingdom. Britain was doing very well, in fact, before the recession, at about 5% unemployment. The average for Europe as a whole was more than 8% because of Germany and France being so high. Now, here you see youth unemployment, which is defined as ages 15 to 24. And you can see that there are a lot more. The low unemployment countries are now more than 5% rather than 4%. But then the high unemployment countries go up to 25%. You know, you have Greece, Italy, Spain, France, between 20 and 25%. And that's normal times. You know, this is not recession times. Britain, remember, had 5% unemployment before. Now for young people, it had something like 12%, above the average for industrial countries, but below the European average. And when you take the ratio of the two, you see that that there are some variations, but not very much. So the youth unemployment is between 2 and 3 times higher than overall unemployment. But some countries, again, are doing better than others. This is where Germany has always done very well in containing unemployment of young people. It's only just slightly above the adult unemployment rate. Whereas countries like Italy and Greece failed dismally in youth unemployment. You know, they're more than 3 times as much. Now Britain is not doing very well on this count as well. It's something like 2.5 times. Youth unemployment is about 2.5 times more than the overall unemployment rate, which is well above the average for the other industrial countries. Now, this is something that I'm going to talk quite a bit in the last topic when I talk about youth unemployment. Now, if you look now at the recession, now the recession hit sometime in 2008, in some countries early 2008, some late 2008. By the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, all countries were in recession. So if you want to compare the sort of post-recession with the pre-recession unemployment rates, then a good way of doing it is to compare 2009 unemployment with 2007. You know, you leave 2008 in the middle as the year that it happened. And here what you see is rather surprising things in a way, in that in Germany, Netherlands, Austria, unemployment hardly moved. In Germany, it even went down during the recession, whereas the countries that really got hit badly were Spain, Estonia, Ireland, Iceland, the United States of America. On average, unemployment during the recession went up by 2%. In the United Kingdom, no, a little bit more than 2%. In the United Kingdom, it was about 2 percentage points increase in unemployment. And again, I'm going to ask why is that, and is there anything we can do, although you will probably have the answer in the essay here. Now, in Europe, as you know, in 2009, the recession was succeeded by the debt crisis. And what the debt crisis was about was banks running out of liquidity, governments having big debts, not being able to rescue their banks on their own, and also not being able to pay their own debts. They lose the access to international loan markets, and they call the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank to rescue them with cheap loans, you know, what's known as the Troika. Now, the countries that called the Troika were Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy, mainly. Well, Italy, I think they called, or at least they were under investigation. And the response of the Troika was to impose strict fiscal austerity, along with recommendations for reform. And you can see here that the response to the debt crisis in sort of increasing or either in decreasing difficulty, the country that suffered most from the debt crisis and the Troika austerity programs, not surprisingly, is Greece, where unemployment in those 3 years jumped up by 14 points and is now something like 25%. Next comes Spain, next Portugal, next Ireland, Italy. Slovenia is just outside, but it is the country that is being discussed as the next one in line to fall. What you see here, interestingly enough, is that, I don't know if you've seen the Economist cover of this week, that it's got a rather not very polite, I should say, reference to the French, saying, like, having baguettes exploding. It's only because they can't make bread as delicious as the French are in this country, and that's why they make fun of the French. Saying, is France going to be next? I mean, what you can see from here, in fact, France hasn't moved at all in the debt crisis. I don't know, you know, of course, this is not the only problem that they may have, but the French don't really have an unemployment rate. I was with a rather influential French economist over the weekend in Beijing, of all places. And he was appalled that the Economist would highlight France on the cover. So maybe he had a point. And finally, how did the recession affect young people and older people? And again, here you see it's where Germany is doing well with young people. Young people were affected even less by the recession than older people in Germany, but in all other countries they've been affected badly. I mean, Spain and Greece, Ireland are the worst in terms of giving a really rotten deal to their youth. And the UK, again, is not doing too well in terms of youth unemployment. It's worse than average, worse than the European average. Okay, I think that completes the graphs I want to show you. It defines the problem. Here's the summary. I have 2 slides that give you a summary that even within countries, if we exclude East European countries, which still haven't adjusted fully to the sort of capitalist free market system, in normal times, you get variations in unemployment from 4 to 10%. You know, why do we get those? How can we think about them? Youth unemployment is 2.2 times as much as overall. There are some variations, but not that many. And then as far as the recession goes, Germany, Netherlands, Austria haven't been affected very much by it, but the Southern Europe has been affected a lot, and why that's the case. Again, I don't think I say very much about Southern Europe actually in these slides, but we could take it up in questions, or I could talk about it without the slides. Yeah, that's the main thing. The debt crisis affected mainly Greece, Spain, and then Ireland, Italy as well. Youth unemployment going up by more, but the ratio of youth to adult unemployment, which is something between 2 and 3%, has been maintained during the recession as well. All right, so that completes the first topic. Now, the second topic is that as economists, when we see a problem like that, then obviously our initial reaction is to start thinking, is it supply, is it demand? Can we get it through supply and demand? And this is what, this is where I want to address you as students of economics and show you how you would start by trying to analyze the problem using the conventional techniques that we have in economics, and whether you would be satisfied or not satisfied with them, and then move on to new techniques if you're not satisfied with what we have. Now, the traditional approach, as I mentioned, is supply and demand. What is supply? Supply would show you how many hours of work. Let's measure employment by hours. Labor. Let's measure labor by hours. Hours of work. How many do we want to supply as workers at given wages? And what the demand curve will show you is how many hours do employers want to buy at given wages, given that wages is the cost of labor and it's also the income of the worker. When the two are equal, we say the market is in equilibrium. Now, to know whether supply and demand analysis is a good framework for studying these effects, we have to turn to estimates of these curves, what numbers lie behind these curves that usually come from econometricians, our president here being a leading one, of course, in this field, not being a leading, being the leading one in Britain, at least in this field. And what they find, and do correct me if I'm wrong, no, you won't correct me, okay. What they find is that the supply curve is very steep, and the demand curve is flatter. I'll explain in a minute what it means by very steep, and that we could show recession in this diagram is changes in the demand for labor. It's because the reason we get into recession is that employers don't want to hire as much labor now as they used to at given wages. They would either hire the labor if the cost of labor was to fall with lower wages, or if demand was to increase. Now, here is the picture under those estimates. And what labor supply shows you, when it's steep, it tells you that that people are not very sensitive to the wage rate when they supply hours of work. Once the wage rate is above a certain level, that gets them into the market, and that's the bottom bit, which is flatter, then that's what they supply, even if wages change a little bit. 8 hours a day or whatever, or close 35 to 40 hours a week in most countries. The demand for labor, though, is the one that will move up and down. When we get recession, it will come down there. Now, what do we get? How would normal, now what I called before is normal times unemployment is something that you can read off the intersection of these two curves, as you probably know. Draw a line down, and that's the hours of work that you get in the market, and draw a horizontal line, and that's the cost of labor. That's the wage rate that you're going to find. Now, what's right and what's wrong with this framework? Now, it is a good framework for the study of some things, and it's good for lots of other markets. But even in the labor market, don't get me wrong, that supply and demand is completely wrong. It's a good framework if you want to know the impact of technology, for example, on wages and employment. If you want to know the impact of taxes, and that's what econometricians spend a lot of time analyzing, in fact, studying the impact of taxes on employment and wages. If you want to know the impact of demographic changes, we're having an aging population, for example. What is the impact of that on the market, you can do it within supply and demand analysis quite well. But where does it fail? Well, it fails in the study of unemployment because it doesn't have unemployment in it. So we have to start thinking, what is unemployment in that framework? You know, there is nothing here that says this is unemployment. If you think of if you want to be charitable and you say, okay, let's study employment then, and anything that is not outside employment, let's call it unemployment. You know, a lot of economists do that. It still fails on two important counts. One of them is that it does very poorly in predicting the impact of recessions. I'm going to show you in a minute why. So if you want to use it to study the impact of recession on employment, you're not going to go very far. And second, it does not take into account many features of labor markets, like institutional structure, which implies that if you want to use it to study the differences across countries, you're not going to do very well either. And those are the things that we want to understand here. And in fact, that's what got me as a PhD student, in fact, at the London School of Economics, in thinking it was mainly that I wanted to study what we thought at the time was recession, when unemployment went up from 2% to 4%. And we couldn't explain it within the framework of supply and demand, and that's when I started thinking, you know, there must be some other way of thinking about this market to understand unemployment. Now, here are the failures. If I want to understand the impact of recession on these curves, then I would reduce labor demand, which in terms of the diagram, I would move it to the left. And therefore, the intersection will slide down the labor supply curve. But when you do that, you get a small fall in employment or in hours of work and a big fall in wages. But that's not what you find in the market. What you find in the market, which is written here, is that you get a big fall in employment in recession and a very small fall in wages. So there is something wrong in this diagram. The data that you have, the outcome of recession, is different from what the estimates of supply and demand curves by the econometricians would predict. So that's a wrong prediction, which means that you can reject that theory as a theory of recession. And then if you want to compare the differences across countries, then you have to look at the different institutional structure that governs employment and wages. You know, what kind of trade unions do they have? What kind of wage bargains do they have? What kind of employment regulation? Because that's what is causing these differences in unemployment. But when you look at this framework, then it's very difficult to know where to insert all those things. The framework isn't rich enough to enable you to do it. And therefore, that's another failure. Now thinking about the labor market, and that's where you use introspection as well, you know, thinking about jobs generally. You could say, you know, what is this framework requiring us to do? And what it's requiring us to do is to see a wage rate per hour, and then we decide how many hours we want to work at that wage rate. So we go along to the employer and say, okay, you know, you're paying £10 per hour. I want to work 5.5 hours on Monday, 7 hours on Tuesday, 8 hours on Wednesday, and so on. Well, we cannot do that because the labor market is constrained by how many hours we work. Usually what the employer will say, I've got a job for you that pays £10 per hour. This job requires you that you work 8 hours. You work 9 to 6. You take 1 hour lunch break. You work Monday to Friday. Do you want it or do you not want it? You know, you either take it or don't take it. You can't start changing a little bit here, a little bit there, like the supply and demand framework normally requires. So we have to break away from the idea that there is a lot of choice in what we do in the labor market and get into the idea that we're constrained by regulation of employment, by policy, by institutions like trade unions, and by what the employers are doing. That's what this approach is aiming to do. So what I'll now do is to describe you the alternative that deals with the problems that I pointed out with the first supply and demand approach. Now, if you ask me what's the key departure from the framework I've given you, then I would probably say that the key departure has to do with information. It's how much information we have in the labor market. The information that you need in the labor market is vast, whereas to work with supply and demand, you need to assume at least that you know everything there is to know about jobs and employment. Now, of course, economists have always known that we don't know very much about markets. We don't know very much about markets in general, and we don't know much about the labor market. But then, the biggest defender of the traditional supply and demand approach, who rationalized how can we use approaches that assume that we know a lot when we don't really know much, was Milton Friedman, the great Milton Friedman, who said, well, the way that we work, it's as if information is perfect. And when you reason under the assumption that information is perfect, you get outcomes that are very close to the outcomes that we get under imperfect information. And he used his famous example of a snooker player. He said, you know, when you hit a ball, a snooker, and it goes and hits another, and then the other one gets into a pocket, changes angle of direction and gets into a pocket, there is an enormous amount of information that you need to calculate exactly how much power are going to put behind the hit and at what angle you are going to hit it. And if you ask any snooker player, even if you ask a champion, to describe to you the exact power that he uses, force, and the exact angle that he hits it, he's going to look at you in a completely vague way and say, what are you on about? He said, you know, I just hit the ball and it goes in. So he hits under totally imperfect information about the mathematics of snooker, and yet he gets the right result. So he said, we do the same in economics. We choose what we want to buy, we choose what we want to sell, how much labor to supply, and all that, under complete ignorance most of the time, and yet we get the right results. Now, that's the departure that we have here. The claim that I want to make is that this, what's known as the as-if assumption, we behave as if the world is perfect, it just doesn't hold in labor markets. The informational requirements in labor markets are vast, and there are differences they involve differences between persons, between jobs. You know, you might see a person and then you don't know how hard this person is going to work. You don't know if he's going to cheat you. You don't know if how clever he is most of the time. You know, maybe he's got a degree. The degree is a reasonably good signal, especially if it's from a good place. It's a reasonably good signal of how good the person is, but you still don't know enough about the people. And the productivity, the product you get out of a job, depends very much on the nature of the person, you know, on their incentives to work hard and on their ability to do well. And the same goes with jobs. You know, you don't know how good the employer is going to be. You don't know how he's going to manipulate the job, use it. Whereas in other markets, these things don't hold. You know, if you want to buy apples, okay, there might be green apples and red apples, but they're basically apples. You know, they all taste the same. And if you want to buy a car, you know it's going to be a body sitting on a chassis sitting on four wheels, and that's about it. It's got an engine that runs. You know, the differences. There are differences that people prefer one model of car to another. I do too, but they're not as big as the difference that you find between people. Now. And again, the argument is that these differences you find between people, which we know as, we call them heterogeneities in economics, they do make a lot of difference in the way the labor market behaves, and the as-if assumption doesn't hold. That's one claim. There are, however, other departures, other imperfections, if you like. We don't know where jobs are located. Very often when we change jobs, we have to move a house, you have to move an entire house, you have to move school. People don't like changing locations during the school year if they have school-age children. Whereas if you decide that you want to change your car, I don't think family situation and schooling and things like that are going to affect you in any way. You know, you go from one car dealer to another, and that's the end of the story. Or you buy it on eBay nowadays. I don't know. So now there are other things that are related to this. What job you take depends on personal taste. All these things that I listed here, these imperfections and the heterogeneity, as I mentioned before, is what we call so collectively as frictions, and therefore that's where the terms that the labor market is a market with frictions, that's where it comes from. There are all these things that stop you from reaching supply and demand equilibrium quickly or even ever. So how do we think about this, given that if we believe that these frictions are important? Well, the biggest departure is that we think of the labor market as being a collection of jobs, and the unemployed as being the ones who are not in a job. And the job is a match between two agents, a worker and a firm. It's productive when you have two people together, an employer and an employee. If you don't have them together, then you have a vacant job, which is not productive, and you have an unemployed worker who is not productive. And then jobs are created and they are destroyed. You know, the relationship is brought together when it's profitable, and it splits and they separate when it's unprofitable. And that's what we call the creation and the destruction. Now, in that respect, the jobs, if you think of jobs like that as the union of an employer and an employee, then it's very similar to marriage, of course. And this theory has also been applied to the formation of marriages and the breakup of marriages. You know, marriages are productive when you have, I mean, when I say marriages, of course, you know, I mean union of two people or two animals mating. And mating is productive when you have two people together. You can't get productivity from one person alone. You could try. And you encounter exactly the same problems, because when one partner meets another, you don't know how good they're going to be as partners. You don't know how productive they're going to be. You know, you have to sort of think about the formation and the dissolution. In fact, the only difference, well, the only important difference between jobs and marriages and couples is in what you do with the product, because in the labor market, you can sell the product and get money, and then you divide the money between you. But in marriage, you cannot sell the product. This is quite a serious difference, actually. I'm not joking. So the labor market is easier, in fact, to understand than the marriage market, because in the labor market, if you have one side being very happy from the formation of a job, and the other side not being happy, you know, say the employer is very happy because he makes a lot of profit out of the formation of a job, but the worker is not happy because he's not making a lot of money out of it, you can deal with that situation easily with the employer increasing the wages, the employer giving up some of his profit and passing it on to the worker as wages. And that's what is known as transferable utility. In other words, you could divide the rewards. And usually what we use to divide here is, at least in this theory here, it's the solution proposed by John Nash. And if you've seen the film, you will know what it's about. And therefore, we have the last but one bullet point that I mentioned, that eventually, if a job is productive, it will exist because you can divide those rewards easily. Now, in marriage, you cannot do that. In marriage, if one party is very happy with what's happening in the marriage, but the other one isn't, you cannot pass the happiness from one person to another. You know, you cannot sell it, get money, and give it to the other person. So that's a non-transferable utility, and therefore the last but one bullet point that I have on the screen doesn't hold in the case of marriages. Marriages could break up because marriages could break up because of disagreement, whereas in the labor market, job matches do not break up because of disagreements. There is an agreement as to when to break it up. Now, when a job is created, how do you create a job? You bring together a firm and the worker. The worker is unemployed and then becomes employed. So there's a flow of workers from the unemployment pool to the employment pool, where you form the jobs. And when you destroy jobs, there is a flow from employment to unemployment. And that's the reason that this approach is also known as the flows approach to the labor market, because you are studying flows in and out of labor markets. Now, it's also known as search and matching, as I said before. The reason is that search is when you try and find out information about the other party. If you're a worker, you don't want to take the first job that comes along. What you want to do is to check out the type of jobs that are available, and you want to choose the best one for you. That's a process of searching for the best job. Same applies to mating, of course. You search for a mate. And the same goes for the employer. And the reason that we call this approach the search and matching approach is that you search, you find the best partner. Once you find the best partner, you match. And once you match, you produce. Okay, now, some definitions now. What I call unemployment in this framework are the people who haven't matched yet. If you are looking, it means you're unemployed. In the marriage market, you would say you are single. In the labor market, you're unemployed. A job vacancy is an employer looking for a worker. If the employer hasn't found a worker yet, he's vacant. His job is vacant. When he found a worker, then his job becomes filled. And these are the transitions that you have. These are the flows that you have. You have three pools. It's the pool of employment, the pool of unemployment, the pool of job vacancies. And the flow from unemployment, the flow out of unemployment is when you get a job. That's what's known job creation. You go from red to green. And there are retirements. You go from red to leaving the labor market, usually older workers. The entry into the unemployment pool is the new entry of young workers that's coming from outside, from schools and universities, and the entry from employment is the one of redundancy. And same goes with jobs. The entry into new job vacancies is job creation, is the demand for labor. If there is recession, less entry will come in, and the job creation will mean that the vacancy will move on to employment. Now, what we do next is to replace supply and demand equilibrium with equilibrium in these pools. And the equilibriums in these pools we get in the way that we get equilibrium in a pool of water. If you want to know how much water there's going to be in a pool or in a lake, you look at how much water is flowing out of the lake, how much water is coming in. You equate the flow in with the flow out, and that will tell you how much water will exist in that pool in equilibrium. And exactly the same thing is happening here. The equilibrium concept we use is what's known as a flow equilibrium. You equate the flow of workers out of each pool with the flow of workers in. And that's what gives me what I call the Beveridge curve. What the Beveridge curve does is it's a relation that gives me the equality between the flows into unemployment with the flows out of unemployment. It's named after one of the most famous directors that the London School of Economics had in the 1940s, William Beveridge. What he's mainly famous for, of course, is for inventing the welfare state in a very influential book called Full Employment in a Free Society. He wrote it during the war. That's why he put the free society there. What kind of society do we want to have after the war, which was based on the welfare state that the Labour government after the war established. But amongst all the other very important things he was mentioning, he also talked about these frictions in labor markets and how there is an equilibrium, unemployment and vacancy in each industry with the job creation and the job destruction, and we name it after his honor. And here is the curve. What it shows you is a relation between job vacancies and unemployment, and it slopes down because if you have more vacancies, then you're going to have less unemployment because the unemployed will be meeting more jobs that they like, and they will be taking them and sliding down the curve. Okay, so now let me study recession now in here. And the way that I study recession is the following. And again here, now I'm addressing you as students. I'm going to show you something that comes entirely out of mathematical theory. I haven't given you the equations, of course. I just described them. But if you write down the equations that give you the equilibrium unemployment pool, you're going to find that, that if an economy is settled down at some point like A, with a level of vacancies and unemployment that you read off the axis, then if recession hits, the new entry of vacancies, the way I show recession is that this new entry into the blue pool goes down. That's what it means, recession. Employers don't open as many jobs. Then you are going to slide down to some point like B, where you're going to get more unemployment and lower rate of job vacancies in equilibrium. And now I want to show you the British experience with this recession. And you see how exactly it fits this picture that I'm showing you. And here it is. These are actual monthly data from Britain, starting in 2001 when good data collection began, to 2012. The point A I show you here is the one up there. There's unemployment of about 5%, vacancies of about 2.4%. And then in May 2008, recession begins, and we're sliding down the curve over an 11-month period. And by April 2009, recession was complete, and we settled down there, and we're still there. It's a long recession. I mean, recessions usually don't last 3 years, 3.5 years, and we still haven't seen the end of it, of course. But you can see that there is nothing happening. We are stuck there. So I don't know what you said in your essay, but the idea is to use some policy to get us unstuck from that point. I mean, all those little variations you see there are not important because any statistical information you get small variations. But the way you should read this really is just 2 points with a line connecting them. Good times, point A, bad times, point B, and an 11-month period where we got into that situation. Now, we talked about the Beveridge curve looking like that. What about the position that the curve has? You know, why do we have both vacancies and unemployment? Well, the reason are all those frictions that I described. In fact, a market without any frictions at all will collapse onto the origin. So how far away you are from the origin, from the axis, shows you how good your labor market is in bringing together jobs and workers. You want a really good labor market to be as close to the axis as possible, because that tells you that for any given job entry, unemployment is less when you're close to the axis than you're away. And you can see that here. The country with fewer frictions that I show here, if it has job entry equal to V, is going to have unemployment U at point A. Another country that is not as well organized in its labor market will have equilibrium at point C with unemployment higher at point U prime. Now, what might now this here is quite relevant for policy. What might make a Beveridge curve move away? You know, what might make an economy not function so well? And the most important reasons are these 4 that I listed here. One is that when the jobs opening up are located in different industries or in different areas than where the unemployed are, and we say that the economy is suffering from mismatch in that case. You know, obviously, if all the unemployed are in Wales and the jobs are opening up in London, it won't be so easy for the unemployed to take the jobs. The economy will then have a lot of mismatch, but if the jobs are opening in London and the unemployed are in London, it will be a lot easier for them to take the jobs, and that economy will have less unemployment. Another factor that gives rise to inefficiency, structural unemployment, if you like, is a very generous unemployment benefit that removes the incentive for the workers to take jobs quickly. That will also move the Beveridge curve out. Another one is employment protection legislation. And the way that that happens is employers are very careful about hiring. They're very slow in choosing the best workers they want if they cannot get rid of workers later on. And that, again, an economy with employment protection will move you out. And the final one is if a country is pursuing active labor market policies that give incentives to workers to take jobs, you know, there might be training policies, there might be other policies that encourage them to look for jobs, then they have less unemployment, they move their Beveridge curve closer to the origin. And that's the feature, you know, if you want to place countries in all these, in the last two in particular, the sort of champions, if you like, of active labor market policies are the Scandinavian countries, and that explains why the Scandinavians have such low unemployment, whereas the champions of employment protection legislation are Spain, Italy, and Greece, and it explains why they have that very high unemployment rate. Now, another Beveridge curve that shows you different locations is the American one over this time. Now, what happened in the States is something unusual for this recession, that the American economy settled down at something like point A, again with unemployment of about 6%, very good, up to January 2008. In January 2008, recession started in the States. It was completed in April 2009, exactly as Britain, and that's point B with unemployment close to 10%. But then recovery in the States came quickly because they pursued an expansionary policy instead of austerity. But the unusual feature about recovery in the States is that it came quickly at more structural unemployment, if you like. The Beveridge curve moved out. In normal times, in the US, point C would coincide with point A, which means that unemployment now should be around 6% instead of the 8% that they have now. Those 2 percentage points of unemployment are due to some structural problem that the American economy has. And that's what nearly cost the election to Barack Obama. Of course, you know, if unemployment was 6%, I don't think we have had any problem getting reelected. He still managed it, but he has to thank his opponent for that, I think, this time. Not his own performance. Now, another economy that is quite remarkable is the German economy, which moves in reverse to the American economy. You see, the American economy moves away from A to C. Things are getting worse in the Obama years, if you like. The German economy is moving inwards, if you look at the dates, from C to A. So the German economy is not doing so well between 2005 and 2007. Unemployment is something like between 10 and 11%. But then something happens in January 2007, which gives it a vast improvement. It starts moving inward. And then that means that it's reducing frictions in the market, it's reducing structural unemployment. And then when recession hits, in the case of Germany, it hit with the collapse of Lehman in September 2008, you get a new Beveridge curve, points AB, that are much closer to the origin, with unemployment being 7 to 8%. Now, what was that? Well, what it was Chancellor Schroeder pushing reforms through the German parliament, the reforms that were designed by his labor minister, Hartz. And what the reforms did was to make the labor market more flexible, give more incentives to workers through active labor market policy, to look for jobs. The reforms were implemented in between 2003 and 2005, and they had their impact beginning 2007, which is something that I hope you mentioned in your essay on austerity, because reforms are good, but they take a long time to have their positive impact, whereas austerity has its negative impact immediately. Well, the Germans didn't follow austerity when they did the reforms. They just sat back and waited for the reforms to have the positive effect, and you see this much more favorable movement of the Beveridge curves than the one you have, well, even that the one you have in Britain, in fact, where there's no movement at all. Okay, so those are the three countries I wanted to use as illustration. Britain is in a long recession without much happening. We're not worse, we're not better, not too hot, not too cold, as Goldilocks said. But we're not better off than we were at the start of the crisis in 2008. We're just stuck there for the last 4 years. Something needs to happen, but it's not happening. In the United States, there is a slow recovery, which is due mainly to the policy of the Federal Reserve and the expansionary fiscal policy, which of course might still get them into problems with the cliff. But the labor market seems to be suffering from problems, and those must be related to the slowing down of labor mobility. Americans don't move anymore the way they used to move. It's not clear why. Maybe housing has something to do with it, although many American economists are disputing it. Maybe the extension of unemployment insurance, which was given as a social policy, is one of the reasons. Unemployment insurance in the United States lasted 6 months. Traditionally, it used to last 6 months. Then the Obama administration extended it to 2 years, nearly, but that policy has now been reversed. It's a good idea extending unemployment insurance in recession, but it should be accompanied by active policy measures to encourage the unemployed to get jobs. When labor mobility is falling for other reasons, and then you also pay on top unemployment insurance without any incentives for more job taking, then you will get the problems that I pointed out here, the structural unemployment. It could be due to that, but it's still a topic of research. It's still these claims are disputed by many people. I'm sure the answer in the end will be related to this, but the exact details we don't know yet. And the German rapid improvement after 2007 was the result of the extensive reforms in the active labor market policy of Chancellor Schroeder in the 2003-2005 period. But because it takes so long for these policies to have their impact on the economy, he lost the election in the meantime. It's the problem with democracy, a problem that some countries don't face. Okay, and finally, to cheer you up, youth unemployment. Why do young workers experience more unemployment than adults? And what can we do about it? Now, young workers do have a handicap compared with adult workers in the labor market, that they start unemployed. You know, when you leave school or university, you don't have a job. Whereas, look at any moment of time at the labor market, and most adult workers will be employed. That alone can explain a lot of the higher unemployment, if not most of the higher unemployment of young people than adults. You know, if you take a sort of cross-section of time, you know, suddenly you cut time at a certain point, most young people will be unemployed because they still haven't got into a job. That's where they start. They're still on their starting line. Now, interestingly, though, young people also don't know enough about their talents, and they don't know what job they would be best at. Even if you know what you've studied and you know what you understand, you don't know what kind of job you will do. There are a lot of variations in modern societies in jobs, and you need to experiment and learn. And this experimentation is something that you might call job shopping. You go looking to buy a job, and you try different jobs. You know, you walk into companies that offer jobs and see what they offer. You try them out. And again, it's very similar to the marriage market. You know, you don't want to marry the first boyfriend or girlfriend you have. You know, I mean, try a few out, you know. Find the best one you can. And the same goes for jobs. If you're lucky, you might find the one that you're really suited at, but it's a probability event of measure 0, I think, that will happen. And the same goes with job. You go job shopping, you go maid shopping. So what is a good labor market for young people? Well, a good labor market is one that gives young workers to try out as many different jobs as you can. Just like a good social market is one that gives you as many chances to meet other people as you can. And you should try them. Now, a natural outcome of all this trying out different jobs is that when you are between the jobs, you'll be unemployed. You know, that you're going to have more unemployment. Just like you're going to be single. You know, I'm sure there are more single young people than single older people. And it's because young people start off single and they need to get into a relationship, whereas older people, most of them are in a relationship. And the same goes in the labor market, that you start off unemployed, you are trying different jobs, and in between you have unemployment. So in normal times, a good labor market is one that has It gives you the chance to try out many different jobs. You are unemployed, but that unemployment doesn't really, it doesn't really matter, that unemployment. You know, it's normal. It's usually short duration unemployment. And in fact, it's a good labor market that enables you to change the jobs frequently and have unemployment in between. It's good in the sense that, that it encourages employers to take advantage of new job opportunities and offer more jobs for young people. You know, if you know that you're not obliged to keep the young person, you know, you can give him a chance, try it out, see how it works out. If it works out, you keep them. If not, you fire them. They get another job quickly when the labor market is flexible. It's a sign of an efficient labor market if that happens. And if you want to put it in the picture of the Beveridge curve that I showed you, then the youth Beveridge curve will be a long way further out, about twice as far out as the adult labor market because of what I just described. Now, what happens in recession, however? Well, either in recession or when labor markets are rigid, then young workers will stay unemployed for too long. And long-term unemployment is terrible for young people because they destroy the talents, they disenfranchise them from the labor market. You know, they take out their willingness to work, the desire to put in a lot of effort into the labor market, and it creates social problems, deprivation, and ultimately violence. So to avoid those problems in recession, we do need a very active labor market policy for young people especially. And the active labor market policy will have to come from the government, and it could take a number of forms. One of them is to expand the number of education places, either at universities or in colleges that offer more practical education. In fact, I think that in a way gives you a sort of double dividend, as it were, because you're in recession, you withdraw people from unemployment, essentially. You keep them in school, and then they get more training when they come out, but training that is provided as part of the normal education process. And some countries are trying that. You know, Sweden has tried that successfully, expanded education places. In the United States, where there are a lot of two-year community colleges, they've been very successful in recession. Lots of people are taking these two-year courses. If they leave school, then there could be government offices teaching young people how to look and learn about jobs without necessarily experiencing them directly. You know, you could have sort of special jobs where they would learn how to do CVs and so on. You could give some specially designed training, although our president would probably dispute that helps very much. At least in his work, he has disputed in the past, but some types of training help. And you could try what the Germans have been trying, to subsidize self-employment for young people so that they unleash their entrepreneurial spirit, because young people are the ones that try most new ideas. It's the thing that struck me most, in fact, when I took 1 year off the LSE and went to teach at the University of California at Berkeley. And well, the year it happened was not a good year for Britain, but when I was asking my students at the LSE, what do you want to do when you leave university, they all wanted to work either for a bank or for the government. They were saying, well, apply for a job, and once I settle into the city or government, then I don't want to move out. And when I went to California, I asked them what do they want to do, and they all wanted to set up their own businesses at the age of 22. One of them that I still remember wanted to set up a business to fly executives to Alaska for chill-out weekends. Others wanted to set up a bar in the cool areas of San Francisco. You know, it's complete. I mean, young people do make entrepreneurs when they are given the right incentives, and in fact, the Germans, to their credit, are subsidizing currently young people to start their own businesses, and the General Welfare to Work program does help in that direction. You know, these are the active labor market policies. Now, if we take country examples, I've just mentioned Germany. I said out before that Germany is the most successful country in dealing with youth unemployment, and the way they do it is through a very elaborate apprentice system for young people. That's the main one that's always been in place. But in this current recession, they introduced the additional measures that I mentioned, like subsidization of jobs for young people and subsidization of self-employment, which has been very successful. The way it works is that instead of giving unemployment benefit to the young person until they find a job, they give the benefit, they give more benefit conditional on starting your own business, or they give extra money to the employer if that employer recruits a young unemployed. And it's been a very effective policy. I did suggest it in the UK, but it didn't go down very well. Now, if you look at the United States, it's a moderately successful country with respect to youth unemployment compared with adult. But of course, the Americans don't give any policy help to young people. The way they do it is by having a very flexible labor market. I mean, jobs get created and fired. Employers get created and fired very easily. It's the kind of Abramovich to the Roman Abramovich approach to the labor market. And if you think it's a joke, you should read what ABB said about it yesterday. He said it's a wonderful club. He said it gives you really good experience it gives really good experience to young managers in 6 months. We learn and then we go and pursue our own careers, which is fine as long as they lose to Chelsea next time they meet. That's the American approach to life, copied by the Russians now. The UK is close to that, but it's not as flexible. Who knows, maybe things will change actually now with the Russians establishing here. But the worst countries that have rigid labor markets, no creation of jobs for young people, older people get the jobs and stay there forever, and no active labor market policy to help them are Italy, Greece, and Spain. Well, Italy and Greece are doing especially badly on youth labor market. Spain is doing badly on both youth and adult labor market. I should say that Spain did reform its labor market actually between 2010 to 2012, but there are still no results at all. But if we follow the sort of German example, I mean, Germany took something like 3 years for it to have any impact, so maybe Spain 2015 will be better off than what it is today. Heaven knows where Greece will be. I hope still using the euro. I'd hate to end up collecting drachmas. And I think that's it. Overall conclusions, it's what I've shown you, is that unemployment increased. Everywhere I showed you how we can change our assumptions, use new framework, and study all these things that I mentioned here that now provide policy recommendations on how to deal with unemployment at all levels, both youth and adult. I thank you very much.
Okay. Well, Chris didn't let us down. That was terrific, fantastic in many, many ways. We have a few minutes. If we can't really see who's out there, that's better. No. We have a few minutes for questions before we move to reception. And would anyone, Tim?
Thank you very much, Professor Pissarides. How do you match microeconomic evidence with this macro perspective? So you've said Germany has a very successful apprentice system, successful reforms, but it's only one observation. So, and presumably there's cultural history, there's a lot of institutional details there. If we wanted to emulate that in another country, presumably we need to do all sorts of testing of policy specifics. How do you go about doing that?
You're asking the wrong person. That's what he does. No, in fact, the German, maybe you would, do you want to answer?
It's your stage.
Yeah, but I feel a little bit awkward. No, in fact, what I said about Germany actually is based on micro studies of the impact. I mean, put it simply, essentially, the way you do it is that you look at a group that is being treated by the program and the one that is not being treated. And the best way to see the impact of the program is to follow through their history. You know, if they get pulled in by the program in the treatment group during the subsidization period, obviously behavior changes. They, you know, say they get employed, but the subsidization has to end sooner or later. What happens after that period? Do they go back to where they were before, or do they continue in an advantageous position compared with the non-treatment group? Now, in most of the studies that they find that the IFS, for example, where I'm a consumer of that kind of literature rather than a producer, is that there is a lot of return to the old situation. So in a way, the positive impact is during the treatment when the subsidy is actually received. But then I've also seen studies where they look at the longer term. In the case of younger people, you follow them up 10 years later, what are they doing? And that does seem to be a positive effect, a small positive effect that remains later on. Now, the other things that the German studies have looked at, because the immediate response is that, you know, these times of austerity, we can't do these things. But in fact, if you look at a slightly longer term horizon, you know, look at it over 3 years, for example, instead of the current budget year, it actually saved them money because those who remain employed pay taxes, essentially, on Social Security, the national insurance contributions. And so if say you were going to give 50 euros unemployment benefit, in any number that I pulled out, and now you give 50 euros a subsidy to the worker plus another 20 euros subsidy to the employer, or vice versa, it's costing you 70 euros, and you think it might be more expensive. But in fact, during that year, the firm is paying national insurance contributions, if not taxes, if you are below the tax threshold. The following year, you are paying that. If you stay in a job, you pay again the following year. And I've seen calculations where the state actually saved money by increasing the transfer, but instead of giving it as idle unemployment benefit, it's giving it to activate a job. I mean, it is a matter of dispute whether the money is well spent, but in my view, also even if there were no impact after the treatment, which is some of the criticisms, I think, that the IFS did of the welfare to work program of the Blair government here, if I'm correct. Is that correct? Yeah. It's I still think it's worth doing because the impact is negative during the treatment. If the treatment lasts for a year, essentially it means that you're taking a person off the unemployment pool for a year. And instead of giving them the subsidy as income maintenance during that time, you give it to them. They're putting in some effort into the labor market, which at least keeps them off the street of crime and all that. Which I think, in the case of young people, I would still support it if there were no positive effect left after the treatment. But as I said, studies that I've seen do find that there is a positive effect after as well. But to do it properly, you need to have this. You need to be able to follow the people who are receiving this treatment throughout.
Yeah, I mean, the Hart's reforms were very radical, and many of them look like reforms that the labour market looks more like. In many ways, there are lots of conditional transfers that are conditional on work now, like tax credits. So that seems to have worked out extremely well.
Yeah.
I think we think that that's the right way to do reform. Nice. Other questions? Yes, one at the back.
The idea of job shopping sounds very positive for young people, but I'm slightly concerned as to whether that could be exploitative as well, and the debate around internships and unpaid internships. So essentially what we end up with is a lot of unpaid youth unemployment, in employment for short periods, which is not then secure.
Well, it's related to what I answered there. It's not what the evaluation studies find, though, that is simply insecure employment. Well, for a study, it's a lot more secure than unemployment. because if the government has a budget that is going to spend on young people, then the question is it better off spending that budget as an employment benefit and lets the young people find a job themselves, or is it better off spending it to say giving the money to an employer or creating jobs themselves to get the young people into the job and get the work experience? Well, whichever way you do it, there's going to be uncertainty in the mind of the young person because there is youth unemployment recession. If the market was very active, then they wouldn't care about taking time off. I was, the year I went to America, as I mentioned, it was a very active year, and they were all happy being unemployed for a short period of time because they could spend the money they saved from their previous job and then come to the next one. In recession, these things don't work. Uncertainties come about. So the question is, how do you allocate this fund, this budget, in a way that gives you the best results later on? And I think if you spend it in subsidizing employment, it would be a better way. One subsidization scheme actually was tried in Sweden, and they are very much in favor on that. They're saying this is the most successful one they had was to send young people, subsidize young people to take the jobs of those who have long absences from work, like maternity leave, for example. And of course, the birth rate is quite high in Sweden, so and they get 12 months off each when they have, I think it's 12 months for one parent and 4 months for another, something like that. And they subsidize them to replace them at work when the job is held vacant, waiting for the young parent to return. And they found that was very successful, and it had positive impact on the young people taking those jobs as well, instead of going from job to job, filling in for our absenteeism. So.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Often youth unemployment occurs because of lack of skills, and because adults are more skilled usually, and therefore, why should we ban child employment under 16? And if they can get skills needed for future employment in that age, therefore they will be more protected.
Well, it's more of a social policy than economic, that you get your general schooling and training until a certain age before you go into the labor market, which is a lot harder than being at school or university. You may not appreciate it now, but it is the easiest time you ever had. What you're having at school and university. So it's more of a social policy. If you read it from the purely economic point of view, you're right, but I wouldn't support it because I'm also a social person in a way.
Surely there is supply and there is demand. Why?
Well, no. Whether obviously there will be demand if you allow employers to employ people under 16 at lower wages. Obviously, there will be demand. Now, the case of supply is different. In fact, whether people will feel that they've done the right thing, that they got a job at 14 or 12, when they're 40, whether they think they've done the right thing it's a different matter. You do change as you get integrated more into society and all that. And there is, and in modern society, whether you like it or not, there is a bit of sort of patronage, if you like, older people telling you what is right, and they obviously think that schooling at least up to 16, the way we currently live at our current standards of living, is better than schooling up to 12. 19th century, they didn't think like that, and probably in the next century, they probably think that we should go until 25 or something. Yeah. so it's more sort of a mix of social and economic policy.
Okay, we've got one up there.
Do you think the UK should try and advocate a German-style policy of like heavily subsidised apprenticeship schemes, or do you think there are more effective ways to tackle youth unemployment?
No, I think the German system has been very successful, but it needs very fundamental changes in the British education system and training and all that, and they've been resisted over the years. So my answer is that in a way, given what we see in Germany, I wish we had it here in a way, but then the transition to the system might be too disruptive, and it needs much more careful thinking. But the short answer, I think, is that it will be an improvement if it goes to a subsidization of apprentices system, but emphasizing more services than German. I mean, a lot of the apprentice system in Germany is still geared to manufacturing, but I don't think the future of Britain is in manufacturing. I think manufacturing will employ a very small number of people, whereas Britain, because of its education system up to universities and schools, got the advantage more in the sort of service economy. But the more general issue of whether there should be more subsidization of training in the way that schools and universities are subsidized, I think that the answer is yes. I think there should be a lot more. In fact, I also think universities should be receiving a bigger subsidy than they're receiving now with the higher fees, because £9,000 or whatever it is almost full costing. And I think that's wrong, because there are a lot of social benefits from education that should be paid by the taxpayer at large rather than the student who is getting the education. And the same goes for training. So the short answer is yes, after all.
Anyone else around here? I think we're coming to... one there. Yeah, perhaps the last one, actually.
You talked about labour market flexibility. Do you think that getting rid of minimum wage in the UK would enable labour market flexibility to occur and actually increase employment?
No, actually, with the minimum wage, my views might be a little bit controversial. I think not with the economists. I think the minimum wage can be a good thing for the labor market, because it removes the uncertainties about what young people, especially, but also older people, they can get. It deals with it gets rid of a lot of the bargaining with trade unions, which is wasteful, a lot of disagreements. But the minimum wage is a little bit like, I don't know if I should say it actually with young people, it's a little bit like alcohol, like a small quantity is good for your health, but too much is not good. So, and zero is not good either. That's what the latest studies of alcohol are finding. It's a U-shape. So having no minimum wage at all, I don't think it's good. If you find the appropriate level of the minimum wage, it would be better than having no minimum wage. But if you have it too high, then it does get rid of the inflexibility. Now you might say, what is the right level? Well, you can only do it by thinking beforehand what it should be and learning from other countries who have already tried it, and then do proper evaluation studies to find it. But it's one thing that is done properly in the UK, actually, I think, the minimum wage. The Minimum Wage Commission. I don't know if you ever read their report, or maybe you're a member of that, but I think they're very good. I mean, I do read them. And what they find is that the current minimum wage has no impact at all. It doesn't introduce rigidities into the market. It doesn't reduce employment, but it shifts all the wages that would have been below the minimum wage up to the level of the minimum wage, which is exactly what you want it to be. And then it gets rid of all that negotiation that might happen below. But I was recently talking to some Colombian economists, and their minimum wage there is about 85% of the median wage, and it's creating an enormous unreported economy where employers are employing them at below the minimum wage. They don't report it, they don't pay taxes. And it's making the labor market completely rigid, and the government is losing tax revenue because of the high minimum wage. And then when I said, you know, why isn't it obvious that you should reduce it? They said, oh, there are such strong objections from the trade unions because they consider it to be a living wage in the sense that instead of seeing what the level is in relation to productivity and in relation to the median wage, they look at it in absolute amount, and they say, they say to me, oh, it's only 500 pesos a month. How can you live on anything less? Well, I think they do live on less because they work in the unreported economy, so they are worse off altogether. But and that's the thing that you avoid when you have something like the Minimum Wage Commission, doing the research, finding the right level and fixing it at that level. Yeah.
Great answer to a great lecture and question session. So let's thank Chris. Welcome to join, and there's a small reception now.
Non-alcoholic, I should say.
Or just...